Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Daniel Murray, Executive Director of Stanford's Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity. This event is part of our Technology and Racial Equity Initiative at the Center and part of our series on race, technology, and civil society. Today, we'll be focusing on the relationship between, on the one hand, efforts at diversity, equity, and inclusion in the technology sector, and on the other, the design, production, and deployment of technologies that advance racial justice. Is it the case that more diversity in the technology industry will lead to technologies that combat white supremacy and advance racial justice? What practices, norms, and values need to be in place for this to be true? But before we get started, we'd like to show a short video made by our students that acknowledges that Stanford sits on the unceded land of the Muwekma Ohlone people.
Stanford sits on the territory of Huichin, the ancestral and unceded lands of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe,
who are the successors of the historic and sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. This land was, and continues to be, of great importance to Native people.
We recognize that every member of the community has benefited
and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land.
Consistent with our values of community and diversity,
we have a responsibility
to
acknowledge and make visible
the university's relationship to Native people.
We'd also like to thank our partners in this series, Stanford Digital Civil Society Lab, the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI, and the Public Interest Technology University Network. And we'd also like to let you know about our upcoming 2021 Race and Technology Conference, Anti-Racist Technologies for a Just Future. The conference will be held online on May 19th and 20th, and you can learn more about it in the link that we will drop in the chat. But now I'd like to introduce our panelists for today. And invite them to join us on screen here. First, we have Dr. Brandeis Mitchell, an education activist, scholar, and data justice advocate. Originally trained as a computer scientist, her work sits at the intersection of data AI ethics, data engineering, and culturally responsive pedagogy. She's the CEO of Data edX, a talent development firm advancing the data science capabilities of the everyday professional, and co-leads Beyond One, a data learning community for Black women. Brandeis regularly instructs, mentors, and speaks and studies the racial, gender, and socioeconomic impact of data in technology. Dr. Mark Díaz is a research scientist with the ethical artificial intelligence team at Google. He earned his PhD in technology and social behavior, a joint program in computer science and communication at Northwestern University. His primary research probes the origins of social bias in data sets and its influence on algorithmic performance. He also explores approaches to involving members of underrepresented groups in the development and evaluation of data-driven systems. And finally, I'd like to welcome our own Dr. Adina Sterling. Adina is an associate professor of organizational behavior at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. Her work helps to identify the underlying causes of workplace, career, and labor market inequality, as well as how workplace and labor market practices can be effective in remediating inequality. She heads the Equity by Design Lab at the Stanford GSB, where she leads projects about the ways that race and gender influence outcomes in STEM and how to reduce gender and racial wage gaps, among other topics. And now I will turn it over to Brandeis, who will be the host of our conversation for today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Daniel. Thank you, Adina and Mark, for being part of this conversation. This has been a trying week for a number of us, trying times for, I think, all of us. And so to carve out this time in order to have this type of salient conversation with such esteemed scholars and colleagues, I am so excited. As we are thinking about this conversation in our prep, I wanted to provide a couple of opening remarks. So of course I have some slides, that is the educator in me. And then of course, we're gonna hop into conversation. So just as a reminder for all of the attendees, if you have questions, please feel free to put it in the chat. I am panelist moderator, so please just make sure that you provide us with some wonderful questions to get this conversation going. All right, and hopefully you like all of my artwork in the background. All right. So let me go ahead, as I said, and share a few things. And as I said, I am an educator at heart. And so these opening remarks are really just to help frame this conversation. And first and foremost, I want to talk about what we're going to focus on, which is accountability. It's part of it's a buzzword, but it's also a triggering word depending on what community that you're in. And so I wanted to provide a definition. And so as I provided a definition, then the wonderful Karen Howe released some work yesterday that actually had a definition that I thought was very apropos that we start with. And so let me go ahead and read the definition. The definition of accountability, this is out of her most recent work, Big Tech's Guide to Talking About AI Ethics. And it's of course out of Technology Review. If you do not know the work, it's probably being dropped into the chat right now. And the definition is the act of holding someone else responsible for all of the AI system fails, of your system fails. So of course, this is absconding responsibility, and this is what we are triggered by, because it's not someone else's responsibility. The more appropriate definition that I've revised is the act of holding organizations. So this is tech organizations, civic organizations, nonprofits, for-profits, responsible for the consequences of their AI system fails. So hopefully that we can have this conversation with this understanding in mind. And as part of thinking through how do we discuss and open up the levers in order to talk about accountability, I think about accountability in 3 separate phases. And to me, it's a bit cyclic, but the very first part of the phase to me is really about acknowledgement. And this is really the recognition of the full truth of tech's role in our society. And what I really mean by that, and hopefully we can have this conversation amongst the 3 of us, amongst all of you, is about what is the full truth. I think that we've had a lot of tech done good and assuming that tech can do good and will do good always. But there is counterpoints to that, counter arguments, counter situations, and they're becoming more and more frequent. And we need to have a better understanding and conversation about that so that we can move on to the next stage, which is acceptance. And that is really the acknowledgement of one's responsibility, because tech is about a whole industry, a whole group of people, and of course the organizations. So one's responsibility, one is loaded because it's a lot of individuals and organizations that need to have responsibility on their role in tech, but you have to accept it and recognize that you are part of this tech ecosystem. And then that leads to, for me, the hardest part that we still haven't quite gotten to, and that is atonement. And we haven't quite got there. There's a lot of tension on like, we can't seem to get there, but atonement is really that act of making reparations for wrongdoings, for wrong that is caused. It's about not just mitigating, but correcting, eradicating wrongdoings of whoever is the offender. And the offender could be an organization, could be a team, could be an individual. It's everybody. And so how do we move toward that? Is this a pipe dream? Is like my opening question. Is atonement a pipe dream? But I'm hoping that we can have some positivity, have toxic positivity inside of this conversation about how do we move this agenda forward. And so I just want to close my remarks by just saying this is way that we have outlined the conversation, but this is just what 3 or 4 people got together and decided. This is really a conversation for you to ask these questions. So we're going to talk about workforce and pipeline. We're going to talk about DEI as a strategy or not, because I always want to say DIE, which means die. Demographics and values, and we'll of course have a couple of questions around there. And then of course, education. I think all of us on the panel are educators of some variety. And so having a conversation about what the impact is to the informing of not only people within the academy, but also the public about accountability is important. So we'll wrap everything up in a very not nice bow about where we go from here. This will not solve problems. We only have an hour and a half. We only have 3 of us. So expectations, bring them down. We are not going to solve problems. So let's just jump right in. I'm going to hopefully be kind of managing the chat, and hopefully people can ask some questions. If not, there are plenty of questions that I have for the panelists. I'm so excited to talk to both of y'all because it's been a long time coming for us to do this. So let me kind of start off with this, workforce and pipeline. And for me, pipeline is triggering because I don't believe there's a pipeline problem. So Adina, can you just, the questions I have are so many. So let me just say, a pipeline is triggering for me. So is there really a pipeline problem? What are some of these myths? Break it down just a little bit for us, please, ma'am.
Yeah. I love it, Brandeis, and thank you for your opening remarks. They are so provocative, and I thought I might step back before I answer your pipeline question, put this conversation in a little bit of an arc and a context personally. So all the tech people on the call should know I am a techie by nature. So I grew up in a household where my father was the first, or only, I should say, the only African-American to graduate with a PhD in chemical engineering in the year 1990. I went off and studied chemical engineering as an undergraduate. I did design work really from the age of 18 to 22, 23 when I then went and graduated and then went full-time into the workforce, and then took this strong divergence and decided, instead of kind of grappling with the world of physical science and design of products, would do that in the context of social science and really, try to think about how we as designers contribute to broader aspects of social injustice and the products that get produced. And so I want to throw that out there because at times today, I'm sure some of the tech folks are going to feel like, oh gosh, they're picking on me. But we want to be clear that this is an inclusive conversation. It includes you, and in fact, we are a part of you. And so with that, to go back to your great question, Brandeis, it is full of myth. The pipeline question is full of myth, and if you would just indulge me for a moment, I'll share my screen. If you could give me a thumbs up that you can see it, that's great. Thank you, Brandeis. So this is one slide, and I could go over many, but I'll just keep this to one slide that I share in my Equity by Design class. In fact, on the first day, and we go over many of these myths. And so this graph that you see on the left-hand side, and I'll just go ahead and throw up some of the text. This particular slide focuses on Silicon Valley, but it really gets at this pipeline myth. So there are over 260,000 members of historically underestimated groups or HUGs in the United States, 45 years and younger, with computer science and technical degrees. And what I really appreciate about these two figures is that you can see for Blacks at the top and Latinx at the bottom, the level of underrepresentation based on their population. And so, of course, we all know where we are out here in Silicon Valley, and we are not doing well at all. In fact, we're not doing very well many places. There are, on average, between 9 and 10% of the college graduates in the United States who receive computer science and engineering degrees are Black. But in tech, especially tech in Silicon Valley, the proportion that are working in tech generously is between 4 and 5%. And so those are just some of the statistics. I think that we need to reformulate and rethink what we mean by pipeline. If pipeline means perhaps that organizations are not the best at going to communities and to places and spaces where they can draw in talent, then one might say, yes, we have a pipeline problem because we don't know how to draw in the kind of talent that will allow us to conceive of the technology that will really break open new ideas, new business solutions, new tech solutions in society. And so we can have that broader conversation about organizations. And I love your focus, Brandeis, on organizations in your opening remarks. We could have that conversation, but we shouldn't construe pipeline as human capital not having the skills and abilities to be able to contribute and be game changers within tech.
Oh my God, Adina, that mic drop moment right there. You can't assume that we're talking about human resources as the asset.
That's right. Yes, we can. Gosh, so my students will endure me talking about this ad nausea. I won't put you two through, because I know that you all are well aware of this, but just for the audience, we have frequently talked about the business case for DEI. Brandeis, you said die. I'm still a little bit reactive to even that comment, but that's it. We have frequently talked about the business case, and look, we could critique that. We could talk about the way that commoditizes labor, the way that it treats women, Black and Brown people, etc. As commodities, and so that's not a conversation that I find is always that useful. But what I like to talk about is authentic DEI, which means we've got huge talent in the workforce from members of historically underestimated groups, and for the benefit of us, for the benefit of the organization, let's figure out ways to reach into those communities to recruit those individuals so they can bring their human capital within the organization.
Oh, wow. Wow. Okay, Mark, do you have anything you want to say before I chime in?
I'm sure he does.
I'm sure he does too.
Yeah, I think, so I'll preface and say that my response comes largely from personal experience. It's funny, I have had similar critiques of this idea personally of it being a pipeline problem, but Adina, hearing you talk about it and show the visual encapsulates so nicely this misconception. And I think, I suppose the one thing I'll add is that I think there's an underappreciation for the types of, not just perspectives and skills, but the types of problems that people of color, folks from, I loved HUG's, historically underestimated groups. I love that acronym. The types of problems that folks want to focus on are not those that are given attention. They're not as resourced. They're oftentimes not considered as innovative because they're longstanding problems that aren't on the quote unquote cutting edge of state of the art of this brand new type of technology. I know we had a conversation and I mentioned, it's a statistic I keep using too much, but when I was in graduate school in Chicago, I was involved in a project that wasn't my main research, but involved issues of internet access. And internet penetration in Chicago is at about 80%. That means 20% of people in a city of 3 million don't have home broadband access. I feel like that should make people go, oh, that's really bad, but it's not a sexy problem. It's not a problem that is, that gets couched in these ideas of innovating and coming up with new state-of-the-art, flashy technological solutions. But for folks who are adjacent to those issues or living firsthand those issues, they're not going to see the same support in their attempts to enter the tech workforce and want to work on those issues specifically. It's just not as celebrated.
Right, right. I mean, I think you bring up a great point, Mark, about, the sexy problems within tech. How do you couch it to make sure that people hear what the real issues are, right? There is this dichotomy between talking about, historically underrepresented groups, and then there is, what are you doing for those underrepresented groups? So are you going to the communities and authentically, to Adina's point, authentically trying to figure out what is the reasons, what is the approaches that could help them? I think that's one of the challenges that I personally see within a lot of DEI, is that it's always the underrepresented group coming in to do work versus the organization or the people existing there in order to now say what can be done, what needs to change, what can change, what is going to change, in order to make sure that I could bring my full self 100% into an organization, because that doesn't exist for a lot of Black and Brown people. They have to code switch. They have to figure out different ways in order to exist within the workplace, and they're not necessarily incentivized from people that I, speak to. That's anecdotally, of course, but there is a lot of conversation about what things can tech do and what things tech cannot do, and that friction, there's a lot. There's a lot of friction there, and inside the workplace, inside of teams, there's just difference of opinion, and how do we shepherd through that in an inclusive way and in an equitable way, because people are in the workforce for decades. We can't just not do it. We have to be equitable. We have to be inclusive. But how do we really accomplish those goals? So I guess we've kind of moved on to DEI. I tipped my hand on how I feel about DEI because of the way I've seen it implemented. I've been on the receiving end of DEI a number of times, and it's always been people giving me things that I didn't ask for, but then what I ask for, they don't give me. And I've seen it in many different places where I've worked and in projects that I've engaged in. So for DEI, I would love, Mark, you are currently working in an organization. Adina, you are, of course, doing a lot of scholarship in DEI, especially when it revolves around employment. What does the tech industry need to do? Just if you could pick one thing, one thing for it to do, you would just utopia, right? We're in utopia land. Anything is possible. There is no budget. There is no retaliation backlash. There is no critic. What would be the one thing that a tech industry could potentially do?
Mark, do you want to go first, or
Sure.
Tag you're it?
Yeah, just one. I really, really wish tech organizations would receive harsh critique from folks who have been wronged internally as an opportunity to have a conversation and make specific changes. It's no coincidence that folks who have been ousted or pushed out of a number of different organizations all have a strikingly and disturbingly similar story. And I don't know who is being fooled by a lack of willingness to engage directly with things that have been raised, whistleblown, brought to light, whatever sort of phrase or term you want to use. But I really wish that those instances themselves would be seen as specific opportunities rather than organizations saying, oh, well, that happened. Let's look forward. I think that there's a lot of damage that happens when that outlook is taken.
Well said. Nicely put.
Wow. Both of your comments, I wish I were the moderator to ask you all to go a little deeper, because I feel like, Mark, what you said, there's so much to unpack there. And then Brandeis, you mentioned being in tech and getting what you didn't ask for and then not being able to get what you did ask for. I think that's so striking, both of those thoughts. If I could snap my fingers and change one thing about tech, it would be to help people have better and broader imaginations about both the potential of tech and the immense damage that tech can do. And in imagining the potential, but also the enormous risk that tech could bring, I think that imagination could spur people to get the right people at the table to have better and broader conversations, to get the Brandeises of the world and the Marks of the world what they need when they ask for it. And what I mean by that is sometimes I've sensed that folks in tech are a bit absolved from the applications with which their tech gets implemented. And, like I said, engineering undergrad, so just like the rest of them, really like to nerd out on tech, right? I mean, and then a lot of it is about kind of throwing yourself into the problem and throwing yourself into the solution. But then the way that tech gets implemented, oftentimes we fail to imagine those situations, whether it be AI, machine learning, deep learning, allowing for broader surveillance of communities in ways that tech then becomes weaponized to, we can build the best tech on the planet, but if we don't think through the broader ways that tech can be implemented, I think all of us who really love being engineers and scientists never desire for our babies to be implemented in certain ways. But if we sort of don't imagine, right? And in that imagining, say, how might I want to approach this team? How might I want to listen to this person that's written a memo and said, I'm not getting what I need, or I'm feeling marginalized at work? If we can imagine a world where that person's not at the table, and then the way tech might be implemented, only because oftentimes people from historically underestimated groups are much more aware of the benefits, but also the downsides of tech because they've experienced it firsthand. I think that I would just love to kind of turn on imaginations.
Yes. Yeah. Oh my God, that is fantastic. I mean, there's so many examples of how tech has done some really positive things. And then sometimes how those positive things have turned into surveillance, like you mentioning. I think that there's a lot of issues when it comes to how do you get this racial justice when you don't have people in the room that have been offended or have had, you know, conflicts with people or conflicts with the tech, to your point, right? I mean, facial recognition is just one example that has bode very well in certain circumstances for certain populations, but not so well for other circumstances and populations. And so I was I'm kind of reading some of this chat, and there was a couple of questions just about, you know, let's get some examples of what particularly what I mean when I say I've asked for things and I get something else. So let me just give one example. I think it's a very frequent example that happens when you are like in college or maybe in high school, is that what you really need is a computer. You really need a computer. You need a computer to be one that's going to last you for a couple of years, right? If you're early in college, you want it to last till you're into college. But what you tend to get is a very little bit of money that can only be used to deal with your tuition. So yes, getting that little bit of scholarship to deal with your tuition is great, but you really need the computer in order to be able to do your work, right? So there's just a lot of different issues that come up when you don't have, you ask for things, but then what you ask for is not what you receive. You receive it in a different way than what was intended. But I do want to dive into and pull a little thread about the tech industry and get a better idea of in what ways can tech industry, the community of tech, all of us, because I think we're all are technologists at this point in our COVID-ness, how can we help racial justice progress? How can we bring light to it? How can we do a call of arms? Is this a code of conduct? I mean, what does this sort of look like, right? How can we do these type of things? I don't know if Dina, you have some initial thoughts about this, but it's just, I want to see us progress. I want to see us not just talk about the problem. I want to see us make actionable steps.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I think in part, we as technologists need to be clearer about the problems that we're solving for. Oftentimes we think about problems as, you know, having more efficient code or being able to, and to the degree that we can start to conceive social problems as being able to be addressed by technology, I think that would open up all sorts of better conversations. I pulled up, and I don't have to show it, I would be curious, and I'm happy to, but I pulled up the website that RAP Technology has. Do you all know about this? So
no, please educate us. Yes.
Okay.
Give us numbers. Give us. I'm a data geek, so
okay.
You tell me you have data, and I get all excited. So yes,
all right.
Share away.
This is not. Let me. Okay, so bear with me then as I find it.
Yeah, because there is a question about some data, right? A question about, you know, direct discrimination. Discrimination doesn't have degrees to me, but direct discrimination, what type of skills, like educational, communication, like what type of skills would be great inside of technology, what considers to be, how you are considering yourself to be a technologist. And then of course, any references on how to kind of deal with this numerically, right? What are the numbers? right?
Mhm.
If it's relevant to what you're about ready to show us. Adina,
Right.
go ahead.
Well, I'm happy to kind of go back to the numbers. If you can see my screen, you'll see I don't have numbers. And in fact, the organizers, if I wasn't supposed to show a website, they can, after the fact, they can get rid of it. But this is RAP technology. So the entire purpose of this tech is to not have to use force and much more invasive weaponry when there are altercations between civilians and the police. And so one of the underlying ideas with a technology like this is a recognition that approximately half of the people that are arrested in the United States are not just people of color, they are, but people of color with disabilities. And there's all kinds of presumptions about when a police officer asks someone verbally to do a command, that that person has auditory processing skills in such a way that they are not deaf or mentally disabled, that they can actually do that. You know, there are all sorts of assumptions that go into those sorts of altercations. And so what this company has said is we're going to try to figure out another way. Now, I'm sure, and I'll just stop sharing the screen now, that we can have a broader conversation about that, because you know, this is not a new problem. You know, tasers and other things have been created. And then again, to go back to the idea that tech always takes shape in the places and spaces and hands that are using it, right? And so we should be mindful of that. But if we can imagine a broader set of social problems being within the realm of what tech focuses on, I think that is just a really powerful idea. And I think it in part requires us to acknowledge the place that we are in history and the centuries long systems of oppression that exist, and that perhaps, you know, there will always be tech. We are, by our human nature, right, technology will always progress. But can we put that and direct that toward justice rather than oppression? It's going to be, there's sort of no choice. It will either be used for justice or oppression. So can we imagine tech being used for justice and not oppressive outcomes?
Yeah, I saw Mark, you were nodding. I mean, is there a way for tech to like choose justice, right? Like, can they just make the decision to choose to actually choose justice instead of for oppression, right? And I guess a secondary question to that is, you know, then I guess the question becomes, can they deal with harsh criticism? You know, and how could they deal with the harsh criticism?
Yeah. Oh, I have a lot of thoughts here. I mean, first,
go for it. You have an hour. Just kidding.
Yeah. I mean, what immediately comes to mind when looking at this RAP website is, I'm just going to plug Ruha Benjamin. Everybody go read her work.
Yep.
Like, what does it mean to make policing equitable when policing is an institution derived from slavery, derived from capturing, recapturing Black people who had gained their freedom by some form or another. And it completely misses I wish I could put it in as eloquent terms as Ruha does. So I'll just plug her again, Ruha Benjamin, that's her name, read her work. But there's this kind of missing element in a lot of tech development, which is Assume first that bad things will happen, and then let's work backward from there. Tech does a lot of great things. I don't mean to say that we need to throw out all of the innovations that have come to this point, but there's absolutely a mythos around what AI in particular is able to accomplish. And it's just wild to me when I don't know, I'm just sitting down at dinner with my family, or I'm chatting with a friend who's doesn't work specifically in tech, but everybody has thoughts on tech because it's everywhere. And somebody might ask me, "Oh, you work, on AI. So when are they going to replace X, Y, and Z? How many years do I have left before I'm, automated out of my job?" And yeah. I don't want to trivialize those concerns. I think those are very legitimate. But they also signal to me that the kind of PR image of AI is that it's further along than it is, or that it's further along down a path that it actually is incapable of going down. Mm-hmm. And I wish that there could be very real conversations in tech development about the limitations and the communication about those limitations to sort of the broader public. I want to push against the idea, absolutely, that AI can be developed from a completely objective place that is impossible. There will always be human biases and particular values that we optimize for when we create our different systems. Those are inevitable, and we have to think about the trade-offs of making one decision versus another. And I don't think it should be received negatively when someone says, "Hey, a bad thing can happen if we do this." Like that should just be part of the conversation. But to be a little more, I guess, concrete, because I know that that's like very lofty. I think one really concrete change I would like to see is more interdisciplinary development teams when it comes to, technology development broadly, AI as well. For me, it feels, my sort of disciplinary background is in human-computer interaction. So I was constantly in conversation with folks in computer science and psychology and sociology, talking to humanists. And I wish that was a bit more of a norm in AI development. These are really gnarly questions, right? Racial equity. That necessarily involves conversation with folks from a range of disciplines, folks from a range of experience, folks who are living on the ground. And I wish a starting point when it came to putting together teams of folks, there was a question of, hey, what perspectives are we missing in terms of lived experience, in terms of, as I mentioned, these disciplinary inputs? Because when it comes to taking racial equity specifically, historians, Black studies scholars, these are fields that have been around. People have been talking about these things. They precede AI, and they will, if AI just magically dies out for some reason, they will continue. And I think those perspectives should be a first stop in thinking about what needs to be done, and probably more importantly, what shouldn't be done, and what the limitations are to the particular problems that we're formulating.
Right. No, I mean, you bring up a lot of points, and the educator in me is like bells going off, because I think understanding the history is so vitally important, in the history of different cultures, because you can't really bring that into your tech design process unless you know it. If you're coming into developing any type of technology and you don't have an awareness or an understanding or an acknowledgement of other cultures, then you're going to be building a tech product, be it AI or something else, that's going to be quite singular in its implementation, right? So I know that there's a lot of conversation, I think, in the chat about, okay, let's be concrete. So let's take Zoom, right? We all experience Zoom land over the past, 14 months. And in the beginning, it was like, oh, Zoom, how do I work it? This is a technology that we're all using. This is how I'm in Georgia. I get people in other places in the country looking in on this. So this is a great technology. But in the beginning, there were some security issues. So the tech was designed for a particular purpose, for business groups. So let's go back to the originator of Zoom. That's what Zoom was designed for, right? But then it became the go-to for everybody. Sorry, everybody. For the little kids to the senior citizens, the mature people of our land. And it didn't work well for everybody, right? So you bring up a great point, Mark, about just getting the right people into the room with the right background and understanding the history, understanding the cognitive science, the psychology, understanding the social sciences, the humanists, I think is so vitally important. Adina, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I was just going to double click on what you, Brandeis, and Mark are saying. One way to think about this is when you have members of Hugs at the table, they can frequently bring up aspects of problems in tech that others haven't thought about. And then when you design for what I call that edge case, everybody's tech improves. When you were mentioning Zoom, I was thinking about, that yesterday I had a wonderful speaker, but just in case I won't say her name, a deafblind speaker into my class. And I saw in those moments when she was speaking and she had just this wonderful setup within Zoom, and both the potential of tech and also the limitations. And I thought, going to just go back for a moment to people with disabilities, those with college degrees are only employed at a rate of about 30%, but having people of color, having those people, you will conceive of what tech can do in all kinds of better ways. And sometimes it's called the curb effect, that people in wheelchairs advocated for a long time that you ought to have sidewalks with ramps so people could move in, right? And so we all are very familiar with this. And so no one could conceive of a world where sidewalks would one day be used by robots to deliver groceries during a pandemic, right? But it was sort of designing for, in some ways, the most vulnerable and oftentimes the most forgotten parts of society, that tech for everybody gets better.
Yeah. Tech for the least, if you design tech for the most vulnerable communities, tech will be better for everybody. There's a couple of questions in the chat. Of course, it's anonymous, and so I wanted to ask the question because we did have a little bit about policing, and given recent events, there are some questions about that. So I wanted to pose it to the panel. Why are we talking about making a more ethical, in quotes, policing, when it's the entire racist institution of policing that needs to be abolished? So I've tweeted about the recent events. Y'all can check out my Twitter as I say some things.
I was gonna say, you want to take that, Brandeis, first?
I'll take it first, and then y'all can chime in. So I think that there is a hopefully a tipping point by now of why there is the necessity to have guns. Why can't there be just tasers? I do have that question. I do wonder how policing is even going to move forward given all of these events in succession. And I don't think I'm ever talking about making policing more ethical. I think it's about, let's talk about the history of policing and make sure that everyone understands the history of policing. And then I think we can start having a conversation about what does policing look like. I think the word is a problem. I think when you talk about public safety and not talking about policing, if we look up the word policing, it's all about law and order and obedience to and adherence to a set of rules laid out by society, but we're not talking about safety. And so I would like to see more safety conversations when it comes to this notion of, quote, policing. So I will close my remarks and leave it open to the panelists to chime in, whomever wants to go first.
Yeah, I can chime in because I worry that this might be in response to my very quick shorthanding of my shout out to Ruha Benjamin. I raised her work precisely because she details really nicely and really accessibly how policing as an institution is unethical, inequitable, and how we can't sort of tech our way to better policing because the issue is with policing itself. So exactly to the point of this question being asked. And I, in particular, really love, so kind of piggybacking off of your comment, Brandeis, about pivoting toward talking about public safety. I believe, if I remember correctly, otherwise I'm not sure where I got this example, but it's not my own. But we can, there's something really profound, I think, if we sort of sit for a second and think about why predictive policing takes the form that it does, when the statistics about who is most likely to be harmed and who is most likely to, quote unquote, perpetuate a crime are very oftentimes the same person. And so why aren't we thinking about public safety interventions, rehabilitation interventions, economic sort of distress interventions, right? We know there's a laundry list of factors that precede quote unquote criminal activity. And so why aren't we predicting and intervening on those? Why are we choosing when we create these systems to intervene at the point of sort of reprimand, aggression, and too often killing?
Yeah, too much so, right? Adina, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I would just briefly add, we're kind of a bit afar from my research on work organizations and labor markets and pipeline issues. I would just add, I know I very much appreciate kind of the question and the energy and what's behind the statement. Statements that have been on the chat. I sit in a business school, and a part of me sits in a business school because there's a real pragmatic outlook that I have on the world, and that is we can imagine a world where policing as it stands today does not exist. But in the meantime, as tech, what does it mean to create tech in the world as it stands today? Yeah. I think is an important question, right? So how do we think about face recognition software that identifies Black and Brown people at correctly at an abysmally small rate, right? I mean, and then what does that mean for how? I mean, so sometimes when we can look forward to the future and imagine a world where institutions don't exist as they do today, what sometimes that can mean is that we push toward the future without recognizing in the meantime a whole lot of teams are going to be working on tech in this context where tech could be used in a certain way. And so I think, thinking about tech as a set of realities and constraints that face the world today is also important, even as people look to the future and imagine other realities.
Yeah, there's a greater conversation that maybe we can move into, because as someone that has all these degrees in computer science, I'm talking to people and reading the work of wonderful scholars in many different disciplines, right? And what I notice is that there is a parallel that happens. Things that are talked about in tech are also talked about in social sciences and humanities, just with different perspectives. So one of the things that I have come to as someone that has been in this tech wheel roller coaster, I guess I'll call it roller coaster. Let's call it roller coaster for 20 plus years, is that our systems are racist. Our systems, uphold white supremacy. Our systems do not want to have progression of Black people, of brown people, of anybody. They just don't. They are built on a white colonial lens. And part of this realization for myself has left me striving for ways in order to talk about tech that isn't like it is terrible at all times, even though with facial recognition, I think it just needs to be banned. I think it's terrible. But there are situations where I think tech has done some good things, but that doesn't mean that I don't think that tech is good like all the time. So I'm not sure if I'm the only person that struggles with how to talk about tech, given the public PR about how tech is just good. Tech can solve your problems. And in the reality, there is this double-edged sword. So I'm not sure if the panelists, you're following where I'm going. Like, how do you in this world of in your own expertise, deal with knowing tech has good and bad, but people kind of label when you say things, oh, tech must just be good or tech must just be bad. It can't be both at the same time. How do you do that? This is like almost therapy session for me. How do you deal with that? Because I need help.
Oh gosh.
Mark is just shaking his head. Nope, not me. I don't want to talk first.
Oh, I mean, it's such a good question. I joke, and a little bit tongue in cheek, but I have not written this book for a reason, because I feel like nobody would read it. So if I were to write a book, popular press book, I think I would call the title of the book would be Nuance. And what I mean, and that just, and it would be about how we as a society have a very difficult time, not just cognitively, but structurally, for structural reasons, thinking in nuanced ways. It's either kind of all or nothing, right? And so having more detailed and broader conversations about nuance, right? Tech is not all good, tech is not all bad. Tech can be good. It depends on how, it's implemented, what the purposes are. No one, I think, to go back to kind of some of our prior conversation, oh my gosh, I mean, the year 2020 and 2021 in terms of tech, the world, I feel like the world is all breathing, a bit, starting to breathe a little bit, a collective sigh of relief because of the amazing work that that physical scientists, biochemists, immunologists, you know, public health people have done, right, to just, you know, help us through. And we're not all the way there, but to help us through. And so, you know, we should celebrate. We should celebrate tech. We should talk about tech really positively, so that my son's a little older now, but when, you know, he was 13, he built his first computer. I mean, I'm gonna celebrate that. I'm gonna, you know, celebrate him doing that. But at the same time, just, I think people being mindful of how it's implemented. I wish I had a more eloquent way of just making that point, but it's like, you know, tech itself, it's endogenous, it's created, but once it's created, it's up to us. Our tech can only be as good as we are as human beings. And so, you know, we can't blame tech without sort of implicating ourselves. We're a part of it.
Or not part of it,
depending
on the implementation. Yeah, I mean, it's a struggle, because you talked to Adina about, you know, tech is here. We can't like take it away because we now have it.
And we would want you.
And
right?
So having this like internal battle of knowing the problematic sides of tech and yet still using tech, right? So it's just this cycle of what is the best thing to do? How is the best way to engage? How do I share this? Anyway, let me just get Mark. You've had some time to collect your thoughts.
Don't set an expectation too high. I really echo that. It's frustrating at times. It's really difficult. I see a parallel when I think about my own research. Looking at algorithmic bias, there's kind of similarly oftentimes this attitude where bias equals bad. If bias, throw out the window, which completely misses the point that like the idea of completely removing bias from anything is impossible.
Well, there's also a question, sorry to interrupt you, but there's also bias. What type of bias are you talking about? And this is a very technical question, because if you talk to people who are on the social science side, they'll think bias means justice. If you are talking with people inside of AI and computer science, they'll think bias is some statistical bias that is something numerical, like it's like balancing an equation. So bias itself has two different meanings, and people don't acknowledge that someone might be talking about justice, but someone else might be talking about some mathematical formula.
Exactly. I think that's a really, really important point. And when I think about, so in my own work, I think about kind of the values embedded in data sets and how those are learned by, oops, sorry, my computer's making weird noises, how that propagates through to how algorithms perform. And in particular, when thinking about really subjective tasks. So to get a little bit technical, my work has focused on sentiment analysis, basically an automated way of quantifying opinion or emotion in text. And what is positive to one person may not be positive to somebody else. And there's a similar parallel in some collaborations I have in my research with hate speech detection. What is offensive to one person may not be offensive to somebody else. And when creating different systems, you have to be really mindful of, who is annotating my data? Who is making this determination that this statement is or is not hate speech? In particular, if we're thinking about groups that are underrepresented or just smaller in number, if I want to moderate or remove transphobic speech from a website, if you ask random people on the street, most of them are probably going to say that a number of transphobic statements are inoffensive because they are not of trans experience, and they don't have the sensitivity to or proximity to the harm that comes from certain kinds of speech and language. And so there's this really, I find myself really wanting conversations to be less about biased or not biased, but biased how, because there are certain biases that we do want. There, I mean, to give a kind of like a very basic example, but we might bias a medical test or prediction to be more sensitive because we prefer a false positive to a false negative if somebody needs, you know, immediate treatment for something. There are, so again, to your point about there being different kinds of biases, but even when we think about different forms of social bias, the like per unit cost of like an error is very different across social groups. If we like accidentally rate somebody from a low income community as higher risk in some policing system, I'm using, it's top of mind, even though I know we've discussed that like there are inherent issues to policing in and of itself. But given that these systems exist, an error for somebody from a low income community and a single error for somebody from a highly socially connected, wealthier community is going to be vastly different. And it's going to hit a lot harder for the person from a low income community, even if we're seeing equal rates of error in a system. And so that's the kind of nuance I wish was in the conversation, but it's hard to get there.
Yeah, I mean, because it requires everyone to have a certain base knowledge, right? Which actually goes to education, right? It goes to how educational systems are tracking or not tracking these type of innovations. Before I move on to education, I just wanted to echo and emphasize this notion of context that we've kind of talked generally about, but I think we need to just make this point made, is that even when we're talking through pipeline, workplace, design, DEI initiatives, there is a contextual circumstance and situation that we don't pay enough attention to, that there is an ever evolving existence of context. So in one frame of mind, certain things are not offensive. In another, give it another year or two, it could be offensive. We need to evolve. Like we need to, and context can't be in tech, because tech is kind of a straight, narrow line. The algorithms are kind of straight and narrow to me. They don't deal with context very well at all. Algorithms just don't deal with context. They deal with what the programmer decides to program. If the programmer has no idea of any context, doesn't add that context, doesn't try to, at least in some part, add that context, it doesn't get in there. So I just want to bring that up as my opinion. I'll leave it to the panelists if you want to chime in of my conversation of context.
Well, I wonder if we can go back, Brandeis, as I also look at some of the comments on the chat, to your opening comments about accountability and how maybe you think about, I've done this.
You're reversing it on
about, yeah, what accountability looks like given nuance, given context, given, you know, what do we mean? And I know you're very careful in how you, really careful in how you think of these things, and maybe just what was behind this term accountability.
Yeah. So accountability to me is, it is part of a continuum of transparency and outcome. So that responsibility notion of accountability is something very important inside of all systems and all platforms, be they tech or non-tech? And how do we, as a society, as individuals, own up to our responsibility? And how does that then dovetail inside of any products that we create? As technologists, as software designers, as me as a data geek, how does that translate? So what it looks like is that there would be, if I had the utopia, it would be a bunch of people, probably about 10, probably one from like certain disciplines, just all sitting around talking about a idea, right? A schematic, it could be a schematic, it could be a tech design approach, and really to talk through what is the extreme cases, and then to go back and actually architect that software or that product.
Mm-hmm.
And that does mean that there is a time duration that it needs to happen. And then secondly, and probably more poignantly for a lot of organizations, is that it's going to cost money. And that's what companies don't want to, they don't want to spend money. So the fact that the time and the money needs to happen to really create accountability practices that are going to be helpful and not harmful to vulnerable communities is where I think accountability needs to move more toward.
Mm-hmm.
Stop putting money into marketing, put money into accountability practices.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Just tweet it out like that. You don't need to make a whole big commercial. Like stop spending $5 million on a 30-second commercial. Spend it in accountability practices. Just my non-business FYI.
I thought that was a lot of what was behind this. So that's a perfect segue, because this panel, I think as a part of it, it was plus society, and so it would I would feel like I'm ignoring my responsibility being a business school professor if I didn't bring up that at the end of the day, what is going to get C-suite executives, founders, et cetera, to buy into all of this is if we as a society continue to bring light to this,
Mm-hmm.
these topics, and demand, equitable tech. And so, we can, and I'm not saying any of us are doing this, right? We all know we don't live in a utopia where markets don't matter and capitalism is not real. But given that reality, I think the more that society can shine a light on, this is the way the tech is being used, and mm-hmm. I'm therefore going to change my patterns, my behavior to reflect my values. That'll make all of this so much easier. And I'm not at all saying that businesses don't still have and tech still doesn't have respect. We do, and we very, very much do. But something that I might lay on my bed at night and think about is you could have 9 out of 10 companies really bought in to use tech in an equitable way. But then if there's that 10th company that says, yes, I can provide software at cheaper, and it's going to do XYZ thing, we're still back at, and so that broader conversation, I think, with society and feeling like, yes, the education piece has got to be a part of this so that the market will go where society is. I think it's just, yeah.
And I think there is a conversation. I mean, I know we're about ready. We're about 10, 15 minutes and then we need to wrap up. But I know that there's a conversation and some critiques of just saying education and what does that mean? Because education can also be harmful right? We've seen misinformation and disinformation campaigns in many different sectors, especially around the US presidential election. We've seen that happen. So education needs to, I think, be quantified a bit. And the way I mean it is really as a place of sharing truth about circumstances. So to your point, Adina, and I'm sure Mark would agree with this, is that there is a need to have more organizations actually share and be transparent about what they're doing, but also that our systems of education, be it formal or informal, right? I'm including boot camps and immersive programs and all the other things, is to really have these candid conversations, show both sides of the coin, and delivered in ways that is amenable to different communities. That could be through art, that can be through seminars like this, that could be through conversations with individuals. But this type of, but education as a whole for me is I think one spoke on the wheel. It is not the only knife in the arsenal, if I can do another analogy. We need to talk about that, right? I think there needs to be more conversation about the foundation of this country, of being, white colonization, and what does that mean, right? And how that has impacted, and seeing the thread that it has penetrated, right? I mean, understanding the US Constitution was based off of Native American constitutions. I think people need to know more about, but they don't, because it's not taught, right? And so understanding these facts of our history, and then infusing it with what is happening in the world right now, of how technology is good and bad, so that people can then know what is the sexy or unsexy parts of it, going back to what Mark said earlier, because it is, to me, all of it is quite interesting. But if you don't have any understanding of the beginnings of it or the origins, you won't even know. And that's where I think education has a very important role to play. As I said, not the only knife in the arsenal. But I did not know if either one of you had words to share just about like this. I know there's stuff in the chat that is happening. I didn't know if we were going to talk about any of these things. I've talked about white supremacy. I can talk about white supremacy for another hour. We don't have it. But if anyone else had any conversation or thoughts to share about the role of education, what you kind of see as the role of education. Mark, I'll go over to you first, and then Adina.
Yeah, my one sort of a quick add is I agree with the things that each of you just said, and sort of what was running through my mind when you sort of first posed this question was, right now, one like strong regulatory force around tech is bad PR, frankly. So to Adina's point about, what do we bring to C-suite? Like what are they reacting to? A number of things for sure, but bad PR will get an organization moving real quick. And so to this question of thinking about accountability, one of the first places I go is education and transparency about how these technologies, ideas, different applications are coming into being. I wanted to tie in because I saw a question, I think, about different communities, and I know like participatory design right now is kind of a hot topic in AI and tech development. And so like in talking about accountability, I'm also interested in how we become accountable to particular, very like specific named communities when we try to develop some technology or go through some process to determine that XYZ technology is actually not what we should be doing at all. And sort of not falling into the trap of what you raised earlier, Brandeis, which was asking for one thing and getting something else that doesn't quite help you. And it's this perpetual issue, sort of coming from a research and academic background, of interesting partnerships or projects coming together in communities. And when the funding is out, so are the researchers, and the folks who are living in a particular community are like, what? Well, that was cute for the time that it lasted, but what are these sustainable, what does this like sustainable power sharing, resource sharing look like? And what's the connection to accountability? I'm like posing more questions.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I already said at the very top of this, there's no solutions that we have here. We're just having this conversation. But just for those of you who don't know what participatory research and design is, this is when researchers, typically academic, will go to communities that are underestimated or undervalued or underserved, and then form a collaboration that is really tied to funding. And that type of participatory research and design is intended for the researchers in order to 9 times out of 10 get paid, but the participants get either not paid or paid very, very little. So it's an extractive type of organization in many cases. And so what Mark was referring to was this push-pull and how AI is now looking at participatory design and research, and how there is this backlog of when the research is done or when the funding's over, they out. And then the people in the community are left with nothing to really show for it, and then no real advantages or value. And so, yeah, just I wanted to frame it in case folks did not know. It's pretty recent type of angle that AI has done. So I wanted to make sure people know about it a bit.
And it's Brandeis, to your point, I mean, it's a problem that's gone on for as long as academics have been doing.
Yes.
Right. As soon as the dissertation is done, you know, the grad student leaves or the faculty member gets tenure and then they're out, and absolutely they're left holding the bag. And then we wonder as academics why communities don't trust us, right? If we have these short-termism issues. I know that we're almost wrapping up. And in terms of a few tangibles, I just want to point out that there are startups and companies underway that have started to focus on the same way that companies will focus on corporate social responsibility, indexes of racial equity in tech, and they're working on these common indices so that we, in a world where we all just have 24 hours in a day and we can't all read 28 New York Times and Atlantic and pick your outlet article, to try to help us bottom line rank where tech companies are on these things. And so you can begin to put your money and your time and your product usage behind what you believe in. And so I think that's one way. I think we can continue to speak very positively about tech. We don't have to pretend tech is something that it's not, but we can continue to speak very positively to elementary, middle, and high schoolers to get them super excited in tech, about tech, and do that in historically underestimated communities, and especially communities of color. We can rethink the way that we structure education, right? I mean, the wonderful thing about tech is that it's concrete. You learn, you can learn computer engineering by taking a computer apart and putting it back together again. The people that are drawn to that are oftentimes on the spectrum of neurotypicality, and we can bring those people. I mean, tech can be an enabler in so many ways that I think we can hopefully continue to take forward what's positive, at the same time being mindful that I believe the best bet that we have is having the most expansive set of people, to go back to your 10 people in a room analogy, that the most expansive group of people there, so that tech can be everything that we hope it can be as a society.
Awesome. I mean, that's a great final thought for you. Wow.
So I just jumped in, especially.
Yeah, you did.
I have a hard stop, so that was my, yeah. Okay.
That was your final thought. Mark, do you have a final thought? And then I'll share my final thought before passing it back to Daniel.
Oh gosh, nothing as eloquent as that, but
right.
I do hope that one of the things I am really hoping for, but also excited about over the next couple of years with AI, is to really look at what cross-disciplinary partnerships can look like, taking into consideration, as I mentioned earlier, perspectives and expertise from humanists, expertise specifically from community members, thinking more about doing some development in a participatory way is not mean that what you create is inherently equitable, but I am interested in frameworks or standard setting that frames folks who live in communities, who do work on and provide their experiences and expertise toward the creation of some system, that they get paid as such and get paid and compensated as experts because that's what they're doing. There's, as a quick shout out, some really, I think, interesting and exciting work from Desmond Patton at Columbia University, who has essentially set up a kind of fellowship where folks who live in low-income communities can sort of contribute to research projects, but also be taught a range of different skills when it comes to data analysis and work, so that they can use those skills. And so in being paid to do that work, then gain some skills and be able to do data work out in the marketplace. And I think that that is a step in the right direction. And I would like to see more of that.
Yeah, no, yeah, I think Desmond Patton's work is phenomenal. Look it up, please. And I guess for my final thoughts, I always close with a couple of things. The first one is impact over intention. Always think about the impact of what you do over the intention of what's happening. And then secondly, I think that we've had this conversation, and for me moving forward, it's all about creating space for rebel tech educators, scholars, and practitioners. And so I think there will be a groundswell of these people. So yes, rebel tech. It is me saying it. We need more people to be critical. We need more people to be looking at both sides of the aisle, both sides of the coin. And that's what I do within my businesses, both Black Women in Data group, as well as Data edX, is to build that. And so I think it's really important to be inclusive, and that's the way to really do it, is to be critical and not be afraid of the criticism that might come. And with that said, I want to pass it back over to Daniel, who is going to close us out, but thanks for joining.
I just want to say thank you to Brandeis, Adina, and Mark for taking the time to discuss some of these really complicated issues today. The point was to sort of open up what I think is often narrowly thought of as DEI within the workplace, think about how we engage communities, how that's tied to education, thinking about accountability. Thank you, all three of you, for joining us today. Thank you, all of the attendees, and we will see you next time. Have a great rest of your day.